Hey everybody, David R. Becker here with BeckerArt, and today I want to talk to you about wet into wet washes and creating soft edges in those wet into wet washes. Alright, so let's get going here. What we're going to show you is that many times when you want to have lost edges or blurry edges in your painting, you need to make them soft, and there's only one way of doing that, and that's working wet into wet. And so here we go. What I want to do is wet the surface. And I have a little bit of color in my water here, so then you can see where I'm going to do a little bit of this. So I'm going to wet the surface, and this will be a wet into wet wash. And then the other way of doing it is to get a hard edge, right? And so if you have dry paper, you're going to get a hard edge. And so right now, if I were to show a little bit of this, a little bit darker, you would see that the edges of this box right here is hard edged. No matter how light or dark my pigment is here, how much pigment I have there, or how dark that pigment is, this will be a hard edge because of the dry paper. Now inside this little rectangle here, it's all wet, right? So if you want to get a soft edge, you work inside a wet into wet wash. So everything I do now inside this little rectangle will be wet into wet, and it also will be soft edged. No matter what I do in here, this will be soft edged now. So I'll take my smaller brush, and if I want to create another rectangle inside of that shape, I will have to use enough paint because there's a lot of water here, and I'm not going to get a hard edge because it is not dry. But we love to have some soft edges, and this is the easiest way of making a soft edge and controlling it is by adding a lot of paint on your brush. I like to dab down onto my paper towel on one side of the brush and then turn it around. Use the opposite side, and when you put down the paint, you notice how there's an edge now. And so I'm going to get a little bit more paint, and I'm just going to keep it going. I'm going to make a little rectangle inside a rectangle, just to show you that you can create a shape within a wet wash. And many of you, last week we had done a background where everything in the background should have been soft edged, and many of you did not do that because you did it after it was dry, and then you created the branches after that, and then that becomes a hard edge because you're working on dry paper. You have to try to do it while it's wet. And so look at how wet this is, but look at how much pigment I used, and this now is a soft edge. It's a little bit harder than because I use a lot of paint, and so it is going to be a little harder than if I use a little bit more water. So if I use a little bit more water, now watch this. And do the same thing with a little bit more water, not as much pigment, and now it'll bleed farther. It's also going to get lighter because it's going to be more transparent because I'm not using as much paint. And so here, look at this. So now I don't use as much paint, and I have a little bit more water in my brush. And look at how much it's spreading out. It's spreading out a little bit more. Again, it's all about how much paint is on the paper, or how much water is on the paper, and how much paint is in your brush, and water in your brush also. So now we're going to do it again, and now we're even more water. And now there's a lot of water here and a lot of water in my brush. And we're going to try it again. We're here. Now look at how this is bleeding. And it's not going to give me as hard a distinctive edge because it's all bleeding. It's bleeding right away. I can't let it stick right there as much. And especially right here, look at it, it got out of control because it's even wetter right here. So I can pull out the paint a little bit or pull out the pigment, and because my brush is still wet, so I can pull that out. But look at how much wider that has gotten. And it's a little bit more, because I don't have as much pigment, it's going to keep on bleeding and keep on bleeding. And the water, surfaces together. It goes together with all the water that it has down there. Now, because I'm tilted a little bit, all the water is kind of running to the bottom here, so I'm going to suck that up a little bit. But all this is about, what I'm talking about today is about how to create the soft edges and working within a wet wash, wet into wet, so that you can create an edge, but it's going to be soft. And many watercolorists don't use that technique of working wet into wet because it's harder. It's harder to control an edge than it is to just do, it's very easy to do an edge that's hard because the paper is dry and you can make it really sharp. Like if I go across like that, look at how easy and how sharp I can get that line. And it's so distinctive that I can make that really hard edge. But now if I wet that surface and try that again with a soft edge, it's harder. So now I'm going to wet the surface, and let's just try to get another very straight line. But I want the line, instead of being hard edge all the way around, I want to be soft all the way around. So I have to pick up more pigment. Now when it comes to the amount of lights and darks you want to do, that's going to be next week. We're going to talk about using black and white in watercolor, because there's times when I need to make this dark color light but still be able to have enough pigment to get a nice soft edge in a wet wash. But that's next week. But see here, now I'm taking enough pigment and I'm putting in a wet wash, and now this will be all soft edged. Now it's also going to be lighter. It's definitely going to be lighter, because what's happening is I have a less water in my brush, but there's a lot of water down already, and so it's going to just bleed that. And I do have to have water in my brush just to be able to put the pigment down. But now you see I have a soft edge all the way around that. This is hard edged, sharp, contrasty. This is also contrasty, but it's a soft edge. But and it is controlled. See how I controlled it? Because I used enough paint. But a couple of spots here, like where it's a little bit wetter, or there may have been a little bit more water in my brush when I first started, and that puddled out right there, and it gave me a little bit of a round mark there. And this will keep on bleeding depending on how much water is on there and how much pigment I have in my brush. So practice for yourself. Practice doing a lot of pigment into water. So what I would suggest to do is just like wet the paper like this. Just wet it up. Take and wet the paper, and then try to draw and try to make things inside the wet wash. Is it a shape, whatever kind of shape you want? Is it grass? Is it a tree? Let's do some pine trees and just see how well you can do. I'm going to take a really dark green, and then I'm just going to kind of go in here and see how much pigment I need before I can stop it from running too far. And don't worry about the value. We're just about the amount of pigment you have right now. It's all about the amount of pigment you use and how much water is down. The more pigment you have and less water, the less it's going to bleed all over the place. So here now I hardly have any water in my brush. It's mostly all pure pigment. But on the paper is very wet. And determining how wet that paper is, see how it's wet and just spreads out a little bit? And so you can then just sit there and draw whatever you can. So sit there and try to draw within a wet wash. Is it a tree? Is it a branch? Is it the side of a building? What is it that you're trying to get soft edged? So that's the easiest way and the best way to get soft edges in your work, and also have it look very fresh, because now this is just a very nice fresh wash. It's soft edge. Like this one is a little bit more water than pigment. So see how it just keeps on spreading, and I don't get as much identifying of the branches, where this one was a little bit thicker, and I can actually identify the shape of each one a little bit more, and it's not going to bleed as far because there's not as much water. You can make lines, just make simple lines and see how much of a line and how far it's going to bleed. You need to be able to work in a wet wash and realize what happens when you put your brush with a lot of water and hardly any water, or a lot of water, no pigment, just water. Here there's a lot of water. I'm just going to put a lot of water and just see what happens when I put more water. See how it spreads? The more water, the more it spreads. The less water, like up here, it stops spreading. So give yourself a scrap sheet of paper, and also work on the paper that you're going to be working on later on. Like, don't work on a really cheap paper and then you go to this good paper. Learn how each paper, because each paper handles it differently depending on how much it sucks up and how much it stays on top of the paper. Cheap papers don't absorb very much, and so everything's going to stay on top. But if you learn how to manipulate the pigment to water ratio, you can almost work on anything. You can work on glass if you need to, because it's all about the amount of pigment you have to the water ratio. But this whole week, what we're going to be doing this week for the paint along, we are going to be doing the whole painting wet into wet. So everything will be wet, everything will be soft edged. There will be one part of the painting that we're going to try to make hard edged, and that will be our center of interest. But we're going to try to make everything soft edged. And saying soft edge doesn't mean that everything has to be like blurry. This is like a little bit blurrier than this one, but right here, that's not blurry. That's a pretty hard edge, but it is softer than just this really hard edge on dry paper. So on dry paper, you get a very strict hard edge, very hard edge like this. Now there is another way of getting a soft edge. Like let's say I want to get this to be a soft edge after I put down the hard edge. You can take water and run the water along that edge and then create the soft edge. You can do that too. That's another way of doing it, to create one side of it is soft, but it also depends on how much water you put down, because if you put a lot of water down, it's just going to all run down to the bottom of the next part that's dry, and that'll make it hard edged again. But on this side too, watch this. I can just do that afterwards. Put the water on after you put it down, and that can soften the edge too. The easiest way and the cleanest way is to actually do it right in a wet wash, and this is a little bit harder, but depending on what it is that you're painting, sometimes you can do it this way, or you can do it right into wet and wet. But do try to get some of the soft edges in your work, because it's good to have some lost edges and some soft edges in your work, and not have everything super hard edged, and then you have to worry about the contrast to make things look soft, because like that's what you would have to do. You'd have to make, let's say this line right here, to make that look soft, you'd make it just lighter. You'd make the light contrast, and so if I put a really light wash right next to it, the lighter it gets, the softer it looks. See right there, this edge is still hard, but because the contrast is not there, then it looks very, very soft, right? So you have to work with the contrast if you can't make soft edges, and that's something like a John Pike could do really well. You could take a hard edge, but keep less contrast, and it wouldn't look as hard. So if I did that same line with a really dark color, look at how hard that edge looks then. Look at how hard edged that looks compared to this side, where it's just as hard. The line is just as hard of here to here, but because the contrast is very great over here, that looks like a harder edge. And then we can also soften that edge too by wetting it. See, if you wet it afterwards, you can wet it afterwards, and it will bleed up into that area. Now, that's not, you can't apply that to like the branches that we did last week, because what happens if everything's wet and and you can't get back to it in time. So it's a little bit easier to be able to work wet into wet than have to wet it after you put down a dry, onto a dry surface. All right, so that's all about wet into wet, working wet into wet, and getting soft edges. And I'm going to expect everybody to be able to do that this weekend. So give it a shot and practice working into a wet wash. And don't do it as a painting first. Just get a scrappy piece of paper like this, wet it, and just have fun with it. See how much pigment you need. And you definitely need fresh paint. Also, remember, to get a line like that, you need a lot of pigment. It's all about pigment to water ratio. So fill up some new paints into your palette so that you can get that look. If you have a Holbein, of course, you won't need to do that because Holbein always stays fresh. All right, so until next tip, until this Thursday when we're going to make you do everything wet into wet, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.